physical location was a different audio submix in that thing, so I ended up with probably like 40 audio submixes in the whole thing feeding into the main. It was a bit complicated, but I found that DaVinci was a good tool for letting me do that in the NLE in the editor.
Yeah.
So you didn't have to go to a separate program for round tripping, and that was a big deal to me. I wanted to keep the whole thing fluid because the way I think about it, the editing and whatnot, it's very non-linear, and I would just look at something and go, okay, maybe I can work on this audio track a little bit. Maybe I can work on the color for this clip a little bit. And having the entire thing accessible in DaVinci like that was really empowering, because I didn't have to go to Picture Lock and then send it to an audio person, or send it to the colorist and then have certain clips come back color graded. I could literally go back and edit anything at any time.
So where did you pick up that skill, though? Like, because, I mean, from your background, like, where'd the video editing part come from?
Well, I was very interested in audio going back to when I was in high school. I learned how to work with MIDI when it was still fairly primitive, because I wanted to write some music and then hear how different things would sound. I wrote things like drum cadences because I wanted to write precise rhythms and have the other drum section hear how all the things fit together. So I was like leading the drum section in my high school band, and then it went on to other types of composition, and from there I learned how to use Adobe Premiere for video editing, but back when it was very, very basic.
Yeah, so it's something you've been working on a long time?
Yeah, going back to the 90s.
It's all new to me.
I gradually picked it up, and when I was in Iraq in 2006, a dear friend of mine was quite an experienced photographer, an amateur but quite experienced, and he knew how to repair cameras as well. And he encouraged me to buy a professional camera, and then later he taught me how to use vintage cameras, most notably Leicas and Rolleiflex cameras. And I fell in love with those vintage cameras. I mean, you can tell I'm wearing a shirt with a vintage Hasselblad on it. And he taught me not only how to shoot on those cameras, 35mm and medium format, but also how to repair the cameras, how to maintain them. So I was able to buy, quote unquote, broken cameras
and fix them up.
They really just needed a little TLC, a little bit of cleaning and oil in the right place. And I ended up with some very beautiful cameras over the years after repairing a few hundred of them and then reselling them on eBay. So that kind of helped me to fall in love with photography and get a sense of the history of how cameras and lenses developed. And then somewhere along the line, I think 2007, I was actually approached by an award-winning filmmaker. I'm going to say that again. In 2007, when I was working in Iraq, I was approached by Alex Gibney about a film he had coming out called Taxi to the Dark Side. I was working in Iraq, and he wanted me to show that film to some of the senior military and diplomatic personnel at the State Department. So I invited the ambassador and General Petraeus and some other people to come take a look at the film, and they sent delegates to watch it for them. And it turns out that the film was very influential. The military listened, the State Department listened, and U.S. policy was changed to try to make sure that the mistakes that happened in that film were not repeated. Basically, an Afghan citizen was just a taxi driver, but he got caught up and detained by American troops, and then he was beaten to death in prison. Anyway, Gibney's film went on to win the Oscar for Best Documentary that year, and then a year later, I met the award-winning filmmaker Jenny Livingston just by chance. She was looking for a room to rent, and she met me on Craigslist. So we ended up sharing a condo together in New Haven when she was a visiting professor. And between my acquaintance with Alex Gibney and Jenny Livingston, I was pretty inspired by the idea of an independent filmmaker kind of pulling themselves up by their bootstraps and making a movie. Jenny in particular, she had a very small team, and she made Paris is Burning, which won the Sundance Grand Jury Prize. And I think those two people were inspirations for me. And at that point, I knew how to shoot still cameras. Around that time, I won an award for still photography and just decided to take it to the next level to see what I could do. But like a lot of things in life, an artist has to think about what can you do, right? You can't just go out and make a movie on anything you want.
Right.
You've got to worry about budget, and that's usually the biggest limitation. How do you hire people? How do you get to the places to shoot? With me, it was more like I was working as a sailor to make ends meet, and I came across something really interesting. My son and my ex-girlfriend were living in Boston, and the apartments there were $4,500 a month for a 2-bedroom place.
Yeah.
And I said, there's no way I can afford that. But I realized that there were people who lived on boats around the country, and I'd heard about these people. So I started looking into what would it actually take to buy a vintage boat and restore it. And boats are not like houses. Houses go up in value. They're sitting on real estate.
Right.
It always goes up over time. A boat just basically goes down and down and down in value, especially if it's not maintained.
So similar to like a car. Like once you drive it off the lot, it's
yeah, but it's
worth,
even worse. Like it's just going to keep dropping. Like some vintage cars will go up in value.
Yeah.
But that never happens with a boat.
Okay.
It's always just going to drop. And I started looking at boats from like the 70s and 80s, thinking that I'll buy some, cabin cruiser, small motor yacht, and then restore it. And I realized that this was something that I could do because as a professional sailor, I was working as a marine engineer and as a mate on ships, so navigating.
Yeah.
I realized that this is something I actually could understand how to do. And when you don't have to pay other people to do the work on a boat, it's actually pretty affordable.
Yeah.
If you can do the work yourself. If you have to pay somebody to do the work for you, if you're not a hands-on person, then stand by and be prepared to pay 2 to 3 times what you would expect to pay for that repair on land, because putting the word marine in front of any sort of technical advice doubles the price at least. So, for me, I had the know-how already from working on ships, cargo ships, research ships, and I realized that I could actually afford to live in downtown Boston if I got myself an old boat and restored it. So I started looking around, and I had been sailing on the Great Lakes for a few years at that point on cargo ships there, moving coal and steel around. And that seemed like an interesting place to look because the Great Lakes are freshwater.
Yeah.
And freshwater is very kind to all the metals. So
I see.
I was I was driving around on these vintage lake freighters that were 50, 60 years old.
Yeah.
One of them was even the sister ship for the Edmund Fitzgerald.
Oh, wow.
The Arthur Anderson. So I literally, sailed her sister ship around the lakes. And those ships were they were in such amazing condition that I said to myself, well, I bet I could find, a good vintage boat up there.
Yeah.
And all I need to do is find somebody who knew how to winterize it, took good care of it, and I bet it's going to be great. And sure enough, I found this boat that was owned by a man who was almost 90 years old at the time. His kids didn't want it. They were in their 60s and 70s. And, he sold it to me when I told him that I wanted to restore it. And that I had been, a sailor aboard many of the ships. This man also happened to own a shipyard. And it was a big shipyard. They took 1,000-foot vessels into dry dock. So we're talking about a really big shipyard.
Yeah.
And he knew how to take care of boats. So when I saw that, I literally bought the boat sight unseen. And when I learned that he was an owner of a shipyard, I bought the boat sight unseen. And it turned out to be in better condition than what I expected.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
And it seems like in the past decade or so, there's been like a whole like movement for like tiny houses and all that, and this is like a weird subsection of that, because watching the movie, it was more like it wasn't just people like downsizing. It was like these, and it just like these people would be like, oh yeah, this is the time that like I almost died in sailing, and you're like, I've never had a house that could cause my, I mean, of course, the house could collapse or something crazy, but like there's something like romantic and like
right. There's a lot to unpack there. I mean, so first of all, boats are the original tiny houses.
Yeah.
All of those innovations that you see talked about on the tiny house shows, those kinds of things, like you can look over here. My sofa's got drawers built in underneath it. It's this beautiful mahogany wood that's original. there are cabinets everywhere. Every square inch of space is used on this, and it's used effectively. There are cup holders built into the dinette that's right next to us.
Yeah.
And they're holding these, 1960s vintage glasses that I got. But every bit of space has a purpose on a boat. And I think that long predates the tiny house movement. And when I saw the tiny house thing and thought about living on a boat, I realized, these things are very similar.
Yeah.
But the difference between, a tiny house or van life, which is another popular thing people have been talking about lately, the difference between those and living on a boat is that you're in an incredibly beautiful place all the time when you're living on a boat. I have this incredible waterfront view wherever I go, and just being able to move up and down the coast, that kind of cruising, there's a certain elegance about it that is, maybe it's there if you're taking your van to national parks or other beautiful places, but you can't stay and live in a national park.
Yeah, you're gonna have nights where you're sleeping in Walmart parking lots.
Yeah, exactly. Like one of the guys I interviewed, the gentleman from Hawaii, he was saying that he had lived van life for a while, but he got a little bit tired of police harassing him about why are you living in an ambulance that's been converted into an apartment.
Right.
And he was basically pushed around all over the West Coast before he said, screw it, I'm getting a boat. And since then he's been living in Hawaii kind of unofficially, because the marina he's at doesn't officially allow liveaboards, but he's sort of been getting by there and just loving his life. So I guess to answer your question, it seems like the liveaboard lifestyle is it's not a compromise on the size of the living space when you're putting yourself in this environment that is incredibly beautiful and expansive. I can walk out on deck and I've got an incredible view of, right now we're in Plymouth Harbor, and wherever I drive the boat, I've got this direct waterfront access to some of the nicest places in the country. And it's like that everywhere you go. The waterfronts are all well developed. This is where people like to live because it's beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, even some of the footage you shot from, like, the freighter, I'm like, that's a fucking beautiful sunset. And he's on, like, this freighter hauling coal or something,
Yeah.
And it's
you see some amazing things out there, like the sunsets by Catalina Island there, I think is what ones you're referring to. And there were also some that I shot in South Korea on the way back home. But there are other things that you see that no one will ever see on land. For example, have you heard of Fata Morgana?
No.
So Fata Morgana is an optical property of the sky when the sky's temperature differences literally create a lens in the air, and it reflects things that are over the horizon and projects them in the sky. So
oh, wow.
What it looks like, this is crazy. And Fata Morgana means Morgan Le Fay, like the wizard, like King Arthur's sister, Morgan Le Fay. So sailors used to say that it was Morgan Le Fay trying to tempt them to her island.
Yeah.
And what you actually see is cities upside down in the sky.
Oh, that's weird.
Floating over the horizon. And it's just this optical trick caused by temperature differences. I've seen it twice so far. Both on Lake Superior, actually, when I was heading east to the Sulaks. I've seen it where a little village in Upper Michigan would just appear upside down in the sky over the horizon. And, when you see that thing, that kind of thing, it's like, what is going on? Like, and you just have to take it all in wonderment, because when you get out and explore nature like this and you see the beauty of the natural world, there's so many things that are just simply awesome, and it'll leave you speechless.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. And like the one thing from the movie that I made me laugh was the guy that said he's talking about how it felt like someone came aboard his ship one night.
Yeah.
And he got like freaked out, and it took him like 2 or 3 nights to find out that it was just like a harbor seal had like climbed aboard his, and like you'd be so close to that. And
Yeah, that was that's Fred Felleman. He's the president of the Port Commission in Seattle, and he's a great guy. I was really happy that he gave me so much time and knowledge from that interview, because Fred was not somebody who decided to live aboard deliberately. It was a situation where he and his wife were splitting up. She got the house, he got the boat.
Yeah.
So there he was, living aboard, and the people in that community at Shill Shoal Marina, there's 700 liveaboards there, and they liked Fred a lot. Fred was politically minded.
Yeah.
And they said, you know what, we're going to get together and vote this guy into office. So, you know, there are not that many people who are going to get mobilized to vote for most smaller offices like port commissioner or local district attorney or something like that.
Yeah.
You know, but Fred actually had a very solid core of people from the liveaboard community who said, we like this guy and we want to make sure that he's representing our interests. And I would say that that early interview with Fred was also one of the most surprising revelations about my whole, you know, experience with the film. Fred said that you don't live aboard because you're rich. If you own a house...
Oh, yeah.
Like if you own a house up on the hill and you have a boat as a toy, now that's rich. But for most people, Fred explained that, especially in Seattle where rental prices are going through the roof, he explained that living aboard is kind of an alternative way of having low-income housing. And he saw it as his responsibility as a port commissioner to try to explain that to the other people on the commission and to protect it. He said that billion-dollar corporations, you know, multi-billion-dollar corporations were approaching all the time wanting to buy up real estate on Seattle's waterfront. And he said, no, you can't do that. You have to respect these communities that are living here. We can't just turn this into a haven for your super yacht, for your tech company.
Right. And Cape Cod, they're having big issues. I mean, that's almost all waterfront on Cape Cod.
Yeah.
And they're pricing out their workforce.
Right.
You know, and people can't, you know, working class people can't afford to live on the Cape Cod anymore.
Right.
And they're not willing to drive into Cape traffic during the summer, so it's like, well, who's going to run your restaurants? Who's going to, you know, clean your hotels? And it becomes like this, like, whole thing that, and like, this kind of, you know, I'm like, you know, well, there should be like little tiny house developments, but I mean, they're kind of already here. They're marinas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so right now I feel like the liveaboard lifestyle is one of the best kept secrets in American housing. If you think about it as a low-income housing kind of situation. And it's not all low-income. You can have a multi-million-dollar boat. The boat over there probably cost $1.5 million when it was new.
Yeah. Some
of these boats around here were $3 or $4 million just looking out. So it's actually a very income-diverse community. But the fact is you can get in the door with a boat that passes inspection. They call it a survey. You have to go through a marine survey, which is a very formal inspection. They pull the boat out of the water and they make sure that things are safe. They do a few tests on electrical systems, whatnot. So if you pass a survey and you get insurance with a certain minimum liability, then you're permitted to stay in the marina as a liveaboard. Most marinas require, you know, at least $500,000 in liability coverage. So this is not like the people that the New Yorker showed in their documentary a couple months ago where these folks were squatting on free boats that they got on Craigslist, and they were squatting in a 72-hour anchorage, which is public land.
Yeah.
That's actually unsafe and it's illegal, and it doesn't really show any respect. They were pumping their waste into the water. That doesn't show respect for the environment. The liveaboard community is highly regulated. We have a lot of hoops that we have to jump through in order to be able to live here. But I think that the people who want to live aboard a boat are actually well suited to meeting those requirements because they know how to take responsibility for a home that, as you absolutely pointed out, might actually sink.
Yeah, I mean, it's...
They know how to manage the risk. And those kinds of people, they know how to go through the process of fixing up a boat to the point where it's safe, getting it to pass a marine survey, getting an insurance company to back them, and then going through the process of actually finding a slip. Most places in the country, you can't own a slip. There's very few waterfront slips There are very few waterfront slips that are available for sale.
Yeah.
Baltimore is an exception. There are a couple places where you can buy there. If you try to buy a slip in Florida, good luck.
Yeah.
They're all taken. You'd be really lucky to find anything. There are a couple in Connecticut that I've seen at private yacht clubs. And it's funny, even the word like yacht club, it has a very different meaning for me now. I used to think that a yacht club was a really hoity-toity kind of thing that was just for basically rich white guys.
Yeah.
But that's not the case at all.
Really? Because I would...
You can buy into a membership at a yacht club and own a slip there or rent a slip long-term and be a very working-class person who just takes good care of their boat. Like, if you're the kind of guy or gal who knows how to take care of a vintage car, you can buy a vintage boat and take good care of it well enough to get insured and to meet all the requirements. And it doesn't cost an arm and a leg.
Is there, like you said, we're next to boats that are, a couple million or whatever. And that's probably someone's weekend toy. Like,
maybe.
They're probably not a liveaboard.
I haven't seen them out here, driving it around.
Is there, like, I don't want to say hostility, but is there any animosity between, the rich people with their toys and the liveaboard community?
No, I think it's actually quite the opposite. Some folks in New Orleans, I asked this question of some of the folks in New Orleans who I interviewed, and they said that the rich guys with the $3 and $4 million boats next door to them and the next pier over, they're really happy to have liveaboards who are there with eyes on the water the whole time. Just this morning, we had a gale blow through where the winds were 40 to 50 miles per hour with the gusts. And it's nice to know that there's somebody who's actually, experienced in marine life living right there. And we can, every time I walk down the pier to go up to the boathouse or to go into town, I can see if somebody's lines are coming loose and fix it. Or I can see if somebody's bilge pump is running and there's water getting pumped over and say, hey, call the dockmaster. Maybe this guy's got a leak somewhere and the boat's slowly sinking.
Yeah.
Or, worst case scenario, if there's a fire, I would be able to be the eyes and ears on the dock and actually cut that boat loose.
I wouldn't even think that was the thing to do. I'm like, I would call 911, but I suppose, yeah.
No, so you actually have to take... So calling 911 is actually the first thing, get the fire department involved, but you take action at that point. So we're people of action, and that's something that really separates liveaboards from a lot of other folks who don't really have ownership of their situation. We have to take ownership of the situation because... the responsibilities can be life or death. Mm-hmm. If it's no joke when you go out and drive a boat on the ocean.
Yeah,
it's no joke. You could actually die, and if you don't take care of things like a leak in the hull, your boat could actually sink, and you can lose everything in your home. So you have to be able to take responsibility. And when there's a fire, the responsibilities would involve calling the authorities to get help, followed by. If you can, assessing the situation, if you can put it out with an extinguisher, you'll notice there's an extinguisher right next to you.
Yep.
There's one over there. There's another one in the next cabin.
There's a few on the dock on the way
deck.
In. Yeah,
they're all over. We have extinguishers everywhere, and it's required by the Coast Guard. So we have to assess: can we put out the fire, or is this something where we need to cut the boat loose so that it doesn't burn down every other boat that's on the pier?
Right.
And that's kind of important to do, to be able to have someone there to make that decision, because you have to do it fast.
Yeah. I wouldn't even think of that. That's crazy.
Yeah, and the idea of cutting it loose, like, that wasn't obvious to me either. On a ship, I'm trained to fight the fire. We have, full...
Because you're on it in the middle of the ocean.
You have nowhere to go. Like,
yeah.
If this thing's going down, you're in the middle of the Pacific. It might be a week before you get help. So, we're trained to fight fires with the full, firefighting gear and, big pressurized hoses and all sorts of different equipment, specialized equipment for different things. But in a marina, it's totally different. It's just, protect the community.
Yeah.
And I think they're like that in a lot of ways. Protecting the community from fire, protecting it from environmental damage. We're very careful about not putting oil over the side, for example, that kind of thing. Not putting waste over the side.
Yeah, they were talking about that in the movie, how, like, that's implied, and they use the term squatters for liveaboards, and that's not the same thing.
We're definitely not, like, the people who are living the legitimate liveaboard lifestyle are definitely not squatters. We pay rent.
Yeah.
We have high level of regulation. Like I said, we have to pass a survey for safety and suitability. We have to adhere to local laws for pumping our waste out, because you flush a toilet on a boat, it doesn't go overboard.
Right.
It goes into a holding tank, and sometimes it's processed, but that stuff has to get pumped out and then taken care of in a professional way that's sanitary. We do not pollute.
Yeah.
And the liveaboard community really takes offense when people think that they pollute, because generally speaking, I think these are people who love nature.
And like you said, it's like you live in this perfect waterfront vista all the time.
Yeah, right.
Why would you want to pump your waste into it?
Yeah,
like that just makes no sense.
When I go out and have a cocktail and watch the sunset, I don't want to see somebody's poop floating by.
It's like I don't know if I'm a liveaboard person, but like I look at this space, and I'm a product of a divorce, and I had my first divorced dad studio apartment when I first separated with my ex-wife, and it was not a pleasant place to be. It was tiny. It was I think this space is bigger, honestly, and it's like there were. The building was basically people who were down on their luck mostly for their own reasons and divorced dads, So there was like, people addicted to drugs, and it wasn't a great place to be. And like, I'm looking at this now and being like, God damn, this is...
The thing about it is that, like, if you measure the square footage on this boat, and this is a fairly decent sized boat, it's 42 feet and 13-foot beam. That's how wide it is, the beam. If you just measure the square footage on there, it's like less than 400 square feet of space where you can actually walk or sit. But like I mentioned before, every square inch is designed with a purpose.
Yeah.
And it feels much more open than that, because when I look out in every direction, I've got a fantastic view. There's just incredible natural light.
Mm-hmm. And you basically have a giant deck, that you can go hang out on. And
I have a giant deck, and then here's the other thing. When you live in a marina, in a community of other boaters, it's not just your living space that matters. There's amenities up at the marina. Like this marina here, we're at a safe harbor in Plymouth, which is a very nice marina. By the way, the Koch brothers own all the safe harbors. They started buying up marinas around the country years ago.
Coca-Cola?
No. KOCH.
Okay.
The one of them passed away, I think, but the Koch brothers started buying up the marinas a few years ago, and they own probably half the marinas in the U.S. right now.
Oh, wow. Okay.
They put billions into it before the pandemic, and I don't think that, I'm not sure what their policy is going to be toward liveaboards, but I get the sense that they're not that liveaboard friendly.
Mm-hmm.
I would hope that they reconsider and make themselves amenable to liveaboards, because and I want to qualify that liveaboards with a balanced sense of rights and responsibilities.
Yeah,
I think that's an important part of understanding the liveaboard lifestyle, is that people in this community feel that they have a right to live in this way that's different from living in a house, a box style apartment or whatever, a home. But they also have a sense of responsibility for the community, for looking out for other people's boats, for taking care of the environment. And I think that's a meaningful part of it. If you consider liveaboards as people who have rights and responsibilities, then it's a lot easier to see how they fit into a marina's mix of people who are transient boaters, people who are seasonal boaters, who rent the slip for a season, and people who are annual, who keep their boats there all year round.
Yeah.
So there are really 4 different communities there, for the cruisers who are coming through on transients and the other groups that I just mentioned. And I think they actually play really well together if it's clear what the expectations are.
So I don't foresee Plymouth being it's taking me a minute to realize that, like, I'm not dizzy. The building's moving.
Yeah,
I'm like, what's
we're moving
going on?
a little bit.
Yeah. But Plymouth, I'm assuming, isn't a year-round liveaboard community.
No. No.
So, are there?
They're hauling all these boats out. When in a few more weeks, there won't be any boats in the water here, and they shut down. And part of that is the geography. It gets damn cold in Massachusetts.
Yeah, it does.
And this harbor has a good chance of freezing over. So,
Yeah.
I mean, it's November and it's already 75 degrees.
No, yeah, okay, so yeah, today's kind of an aberration. Like we just got some warm weather from Hurricane Nicole coming north, and that's where that gale came from. It was a tropical depression over land, and it turned into a gale here. But those hurricanes have a lot of they're fed by warm water, and that's why it's so unusually hot. Tomorrow it's probably going to be 40 degrees.
Yeah.
When I'm sailing south, but yeah. So for the most part, though, in Plymouth and other parts further north too, they will shut down most marinas for the winter season. I was living at Constitution Marina in downtown Boston, which is right at the outlet of the Charles.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually a great liveaboard marina. It's one of my favorite in the country. It's a really beautifully run marina, great community. There are probably close to 100 people who live aboard their boats there. This relatively large community for liveaboard standards. And once in a while the harbor does freeze over, but there are ways that people can protect against that. They have things called bubblers that they agitate the water with these little underwater fans.
Yeah.
And it sort of prevents it from freezing over. And the water's brackish, so it doesn't freeze at 32 degrees. It's maybe 29 or something like that. So it really has to get cold out for it to freeze over in these harbors. But we're in New England, so it's not the most liveaboard friendly. Now, as you noticed from the movie, most of the people I interviewed were a little
Hawaii,
bit further
Orleans,
south, Pacific Northwest.
Yep.
One thing that surprised me was the gentleman I interviewed in Alaska, Jamie Lyons, he was a marine biologist. Now he's a boat captain.
And he claimed it didn't get very cold in Alaska.
Well, he said at sea level.
At sea level, yeah.
if you remember those clips that I showed though from that particular part. You could see the Kenai Fjords and Prince William Sound, which were, beautiful at sea level.
Yeah.
But the mountains in the background had snow halfway up, and that's what he liked about it, was the fact that he could go from Pacific Northwest weather, which was maybe 5 or 10 degrees colder than Seattle in the wintertime, and he could just hike up the mountains to go to do his backcountry snowboarding.
Yeah.
He was a big winter sports fan. So that was something that really caught me off guard. Alaska's a beautiful place. If you haven't been, go. Go in the summertime, at first, so that you're not traumatized by frostbite or whatnot. But
yeah.
But like Jamie said, at sea level, it rarely gets below 32 degrees, which was really a shock to me.
Yeah, I was a little unbelieving. Kind of be like, is he just used to it, or is it really like that?
I think there's a lot of truthiness to it.
Yeah. So, are there unwritten rules amongst the liveaboard community that are kind of like, I don't want to say industry standards, but just kind of like rules that everyone lives by? The Jeep wave, or is there something that liveaboards all kind of like? If you run into another liveaboard, do you pass? Oh, here's a bottle of something that I got here. Is there some sort of?
Well, I can tell you that
I don't know if I phrased that.
In the last few years, so many people have been divided by political differences, and social media has exacerbated that in many ways.
Yep.
What I can say about the liveaboard community is that people across political lines are still very close.
Oh,
They're
okay.
happy to invite each other over for drinks. We might politely ask each other about, why do you like this aspect of something political? Or there might be some polite political conversation. But for the most part, we are overwhelmingly united by the fact that we have a very unusual lifestyle, and we respect each other's advice and opinions and help. Liveaboards, I guess the biggest unwritten rule of liveaboard community is when somebody's got a problem, whether it's a technical problem or they have questions about how to navigate something, the community is there for you. That's the unwritten rule, is that we stick out, we stick our necks out for each other and look out for each other to make sure that that things are taken care of, and that we look out for each other's boats, and we look out for each other in terms of our mental health and our well-being.
Yeah.
We don't leave somebody out there hanging with a problem that they can't fix. If their toilet doesn't flush, somebody's going to be over there with a wrench to help them figure out what it is.
Is there a lot of it seems like it can be very isolating. Like, there were a lot of couples that lived together on the boats, but there was the one guy who said he used his boat to kind of like isolate himself after 9/11.
Right. Yeah.
Which, everyone has their own way of dealing with things, but there are people that's a really bad thing to do, is to isolate yourself. Are there kind of, I guess, liveaboard hermits that are trying to get away from people and just...
Well, yeah. So the person you're talking about is Mark Nicholas, who is a fantastic guy. He wrote a book,
right?
He wrote a great book called The Essentials of Living Aboard a Boat, and that's available on Amazon. I read several books related to cruising and boating, and that one stood out as being very useful. So Mark was a lawyer by education, but he ended up running a photography studio out in LA, and he's a really interesting guy. His story about taking his boat out of Boston after 9/11 was really an interesting perspective on what a boat can mean for someone emotionally. Mark said that after 9/11, he took his boat outside of the Boston Harbor Islands and dropped anchor, and he just waited, and he let everything sink in. He didn't listen to the radio, he didn't call anyone, he just let everything sink in.
And he had offices in the Twin Towers. Like,
yes.
It was close to home for him.
Mark, as a lawyer, had an office in one of the Twin Towers, and he could have been up there when it happened. He knew people who were killed. So this was a very heavy loss for him. And I think the boat, as he said, it gave him the ability to hide, and it gave him the ability to process things on his own time scale, without the distraction of all of the other things that we have in our daily lives. And I think that kind of ability to isolate and process things emotionally is very difficult to find in other places. One might be able to go to a national park or something for a while, or drive across
I was
the
going to say,
country,
like, a lot of times when I'm, in that headspace, I'll come down to the shore here, or I'll walk the jetty, or I go into the woods.
But like, still, you've got to go back and face the next day you're at work again. Right. And so the boat is different because, and I experienced this myself, when I first brought my boat across country, I had been restoring the boat on the border of Minnesota and Wisconsin for, I don't know, 2.5 years. It took a lot longer than
Were you living in the boat at that time?
So I was working on ships for at least half the year, maybe 7 months. Then I would do a month of training in Fort Lauderdale to upgrade my license, and then every bit of spare time that I had left over, I was on this boat, which was still sitting on blocks next to this guy's barn, right? And we had a rental agreement where I was giving him a couple $100 a month to keep the boat there, and he was very kind to let me use his tools from his construction company to work on the restoration. So we had a very nice agreement. And his family is fantastic. The Benish family, they're just amazing, and I thanked him first in the credits because they were just such a emotionally such a meaningful part of me being able to make this film. So Brooke and Sandy and his kids were just really, really great. Sorry, I lost my train of thought a little bit.
That's all right. The show's rarely on the tracks.
So what we were saying about bringing it over here, can't remember where I was going to go with that. This is a really good beer, by the way.
That's is that Beowulf?
Yes.
Beowulf, they're out of Amesbury. We've worked with them a few times. Great brewery. We went up there one time, and we were like packing up. We were finished up the event, and they're like, "Hang on." I'm like, "What?" And they hand me a case of beer. I'm like, you want me to take a case of beer? They're like, no, they're short pours.
Yeah.
They're like, so we can't sell them. It's whatever, like, as they were filling
Yeah.
the cans, like, you get to a point where, like, whatever keg they were filling from would run out, and you get, like, 3/4 of a beer in a can. Yeah. So it was just this entire case of, like, somewhere between half and 3/4 full cans, and, like, just take them. I'm like, all right. But, yeah, good bunch of guys there.
Yeah, well, if we have a few more beers and a couple shots of something, I can give you drunk history on John Paul Jones, and
All right. I'm in.
that'll be fun.
Yeah.
Anyway, that motherfucker, you know, he didn't get his command of an American tall ship that he wanted. They commissioned 6 tall ships.
Yeah.
Okay, and he didn't get command of one, and he was kind of pissed, and ended up deciding to go work for the Russian Navy after a while.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So he sailed for the Russians. They paid him a lot. I think it was Queen Catherine, and she. They paid him a lot of money, and he had like rights to, to keep some of the booty from.
So he was like a privateer kind of thing?
Yeah, he was more. He was
wow.
a little bit mercenary.
Wow.
You know, they like to say he's the father of the American Navy, but that motherfucker was a capitalist, and he ended up
the rose-colored glasses of history.
Right,
you know?
right, and he didn't. It didn't really go well for him there either. He ended up resigning in scandal. Something about him having an affair with a young woman, a very young woman.
Yep.
And he ended up dying in France as a pauper. He was completely penniless, and his body was there for many years before somebody said, "Hey, this is John Paul Jones. He's the father of the American Navy," as they now dubbed him. And they decided to exhume the body and brought him back to America. And now he's in a tomb, enshrined at the United States Naval Academy.
No kidding.
Yeah. And
that's funny.
People have no idea that he was basically like available to the highest bidder.
Yeah.
And yeah, he did some really cool stuff, like during the. He turned the British against the War of 1812 by literally attacking the British coast and capturing somebody who was, I don't know, princess or duchess or something. I don't care about royalty. Somebody who had some pretense of divine anointment.
Yeah.
So he captures one of
Vice
these people.
Duke Earl of such and such. Yeah.
He made that war unpopular on the British homeland, and it ended shortly afterward. So he did some very, very good things for the United States, but he was like, motherfuckers, I wanted my tall ship.
That's really interesting. And I love it. So much of your movie spoke to me because I feel like part of this lifestyle that you're living is because you get to go to these places. You're here in Plymouth.
Yeah, this is a fantastic town, by the way. Everybody should come to Plymouth.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody knows about Plymouth Rock, and I saw it. It's real.
But
it's actually a really beautiful town, and I think it's a great place for people to come for a few days.
It is. So many people I talk to, and they're like, "Oh, Plymouth Rock." I'm like, "Yeah, I mean, see it."
Yeah.
And it's unimpressive. It's more impressive when you learn some of the history about it. But this town is really more like food central and arts, and there's really great bands around here. Like one of my favorite stories, I was there's this bar up on Main Street called Main Street, and it is kind of known for being the bar that every 21-year-old goes to just get like completely sloppy. And I was there one night because a friend of mine was playing, and I went with another friend, and he had a guitarist stop by, and I can hear the table behind me and be like, "That guy's really, really good. Like he could be like he could be like in a band. Like he's top notch." I'm like, "Yeah, he tours the country. Like he's in this band called the Elevators, and like he happened to be home, so he dropped in." Played a local set in this bar, and like he's played Red Rock and
that's cool.
Costa Rica, and they tour all over the place, and it's just like that. Yeah, that's the type of talent that you can see just hanging out in the local dump bar.
Yeah.
And
well, so I mentioned before that I wasn't really planning on being in Plymouth today.
It was kind of an accident, right?
Right. I would say an incident more than an accident.
Okay.
So I was sailing out of Boston.
Yeah.
Okay, and I'm on the boat that I restored in the movie, the KGB, which, by the way, is my mom's initials.
Okay, I was going to ask about that because
Yeah,
you painted like the sickle and the hammer, and I'm like,
It's a family joke.
Okay.
It's a family joke. Like, there's that. Like, it's my mom's initials, but it's also, like, the actual KGB is interesting to me because, like, I wrote a screenplay about them years ago, about how they tried to kill Ukraine's founding father. That was 9 years ago, before they
Poignant
took
now.
Crimea.
Yeah.
Before they took Crimea.
Yeah.
And I haven't been able to sell that script for some reason. Anyway, so I'm on the boat, and I decide that I need to get it to Baltimore because my ex and my son are no longer living in Boston. She got a job in Washington, D.C., and instead of like going to get an apartment in D.C. or Baltimore, I'm just like, well,
You have an apartment. It moves.
I'm just gonna sail south. That's one of the amazing things about it. Like, you can relocate the boat and still be at home, but it doesn't feel. You can experience everything anew when you're moving the boat to a new place, and I think the van life people get this. They probably get it more often than they want because they have to move. They're being forced out of some parking lot, like you said. But with Liveaboards, it's more long term. Like, you set up a year-long lease here or a multi-year lease here. And what I actually did was I bought a boat slip in Baltimore for a very reasonable price. And I'm moving my boat down there to the Inner Harbor, which is a fantastic neighborhood. And I'll be able to drive to see my son over in Washington, D.C. very easily. So I set out from Boston a couple weeks ago, and it was a foggy morning, maybe 200 yards of visibility. And I went to the fuel dock to gas up, and the guy at the fuel dock said, "Man, you got to be fucking crazy to go out in weather like this." And I was looking around thinking, I drove submarines before. Like, I've had worse visibility than this. 200 yards is okay for a little boat. And I was fine with it, so I went out anyway, and I drove past the Boston Harbor Islands, and when I got out into the ocean chop, and the boat started rocking like 15, 20 degrees either side, I started having engine trouble. They started stalling out, and I couldn't figure out what was going on, and eventually I stalled out entirely, and I couldn't get the engines running, and I realized that there was some sort of gunk in my fuel. The new fuels. The new fuels that we put in at the dock had ethanol in it, and my old fuel tanks had never seen that before. They had it used to be like 93 octane leaded gasoline only for this engine. So I realized what was happening was the fuel, the ethanol was like washing the inside of the tanks and loosening up gunk that was in there.
Oh, so it's basically cleaning the tank that you didn't want to clean.
Like, I tried to clean it, I drained it out, and I rinsed it, but I didn't do a good enough job. So I realized that the engines were sucking up gunk from this fuel tank, and I needed to get towed in. So I called the Boat US, which I have a membership with, and they towed me into Plymouth.
Is that like AAA for cards?
It's like AAA, yeah. Boat US is fantastic, and if you have a boat and you're going, if you're going out at all, you need some sort of towing insurance.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're in big trouble, because if somebody, just like a privateer, comes up and tows you, then the law of the sea allows them to claim half the value of your boat. So
for real, that's a thing?
Yeah, it's a thing. Like admiralty law, if you're out at sea and somebody comes to rescue you, like, they can claim. But if you have an insurance company like Boat US, then they come out and rescue you. So Boat US rescued me, and they brought me in, put me on an anchor, at a mooring ball, and I thought I fixed the problem, and I set out again the next morning. And no, not so much. Turns out that it was a little more complicated than what I originally thought. And the weather was beautiful, so I said, you know what? I'll just drop anchor and work on it out at sea.
Yeah.
So I did. I dropped anchor like a mile east of Plymouth, and it was great for that day. But the next day, there was a weather advisory that I missed, and the weather got really nasty really fast. And I found myself caught in a gale.
Yeah.
Where the winds were over 40 miles per hour, and the waves were...
Now, according to the guy in the movie, that's not a storm. It's What do you
That's
say?
true.
Interesting, exciting sailing.
That's
what he
exciting
said.
sailing,
Yeah.
right? He's
When he said that,
Michael Barber said that
I laughed
that
at
was
that.
exciting sailing,
Yeah.
right? And he's a sailboat captain who's single-handed across the Atlantic a few times, so he's a very experienced captain.
Yeah.
But it's different when you actually have propulsion and when you don't. And I was stuck there with basically trying to repair an engine problem at anchor, and then this little gale comes through, and all of a sudden I'm out there with a 42-foot boat is still a pretty good sized boat, but when the seas are 10 to 12 feet high, that's a different story.
Yeah.
I mean, from 100 yards away, you couldn't even see the boat under the swells,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I was out there for about 15 hours in this gale, and about 12 hours into it, I called the Coast Guard and said, I think I'm in trouble. Only time in my life I've ever been pulled off a vessel because they were concerned about my safety. And they said to me, do you want us to remove you from the vessel? And I said, not yet, but if it gets any worse, I'm afraid that I'm going to be in trouble. I almost put my head through a window.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, if I had done that, if I had slipped a little bit and broken the window with my forehead, I could be bleeding and unconscious on the deck, and they wouldn't even be able to approach me right now. They wouldn't even be able to get on the boat because it was bouncing around so much.
And that's what I'm talking about. It's like
everyone on that movie had and that's the time I almost died.
Yeah. So, I've this year alone, I've sailed 20,000 miles. I went from Virginia to Kuwait in September. That's a 10,000-mile voyage right there. And before that, I'd sailed many.
Not on this boat.
Not on this boat.
Yeah,
no.
okay.
That was on a commercial cargo ship,
Yeah.
a 600-foot ship. And then before that, I'd worked on a cargo ship moving between Israel, Egypt, and Turkey. And I made 15 trips back and forth shuttling cargo to the Suez Canal. So, I sail all the time. And I spend 99% of my life on the water. But this was actually the first time I'd ever had to abandon ship, so to speak.
Yeah.
When the Plymouth Harbor Master came to pull me off my boat, and those guys did a great job. They were very professional, and they pulled me out of a pretty hairy situation. And then Boat US went back a few hours later, and George and Ryan, who were driving, managed to save my boat and even the anchor. The anchor, we had to cut it loose, and I tied a buoy on the end of it, a floater on the end of it, so that we could go back and find it later, and we found it.
Oh, that's awesome.
There was basically no damage. I lost a teacup that got broken.
I suppose that's acceptable.
Yeah. Like I thought I could have died, so I was pretty happy coming out of that. And the boat was, it's a very strong boat, steel hulled, and it's very well built, so it weathered the storm. And, now, I guess the situation now for me is that, even though I'm an experienced sailor, I'm single-handing it.
Right.
I'm the only guy on this boat right now trying to drive it on a 400-mile trip. And that's, some people might think that's crazy. To me, it's like a matter of managing the risk. And if I break it down into bites that I can digest, then it's something that's doable and safe.
Yeah. Well, it's just like if you're driving to Florida. You have to know when to pull over and get a hotel room to, spend the night, or, I don't know what the comparative...
Yeah, it's, I don't know, last time I drove across Florida a few times when I was making this movie, and there's some rest stops in Florida where they've got these signs that are like, beware of snakes. And stuff like that, you know? Especially when you go across Alligator Alley.
Yeah. I think your sunglasses are right behind you.
No, thanks. I'm actually just going to shut this.
Oh, sure.
So I think it's in Alligator Alley where they have these signs saying beware of the snakes at the rest stops in Florida. So it's you can't go sit out on the park bench and take a nap there because you might get bitten by some random reptile. I don't know if it compares directly to the boat. Like the thing with the thing with boating is that the ocean is one of those really scary places. You know, I sometimes ask people, like, do you have any idea how many people have died out there?
Oh, lots.
Yeah,
lots.
Nobody really knows though how many, because it's a fucking ton.
Yeah.
You know, throughout history, so many people have died out on the water.
And even
so,
and I think we have this misconception that, like, oh, that was back then.
yeah,
You know,
right.
but no, like,
Who was that football player or baseball player who died last year from the boating accident? Right?
Yeah, and we just did a episode of one of our other shows about the is it the Andrea Dory, the fishing boat that went into the perfect storm.
Did you hear about how William Shatner just went to space recently? And he said he looked out the window at planet Earth and he said, "Wow, there's life, and everything around it was death." That's how he described the vacuum of space. It was just not life. And I've thought about things in that sense for a long time. Every time I go out to sea on a cargo ship, especially if I'm walking across the deck at night and nobody else is out there,
If you go overboard,
I look at the railing and think, I think
Yeah.
on this side I'm alive, and if I fall over that railing, I'm dead.
Yeah.
Because I would be gone from hypothermia long before they ever even realized that I was missing from the ship. So those are realities that we face when we're out at sea, especially when we're alone or just isolated in some context. Yeah, you have to be, respectful of those realities. But
do you ever see yourself returning to a quote unquote normal life?
I don't know if I could ever go back to living just in an apartment or a house.
Yeah.
I think so there are a couple things that I want to say about that. One is that as someone who drives cargo ships and research ships and yachts for a living, I'm used to traveling to my workplace, spending a few months there, and then coming home for a few months of vacation. And a professional sailor typically works 6 months a year and then has 6 months of paid time off. So the idea of having a workplace that's decoupled from my home is not something new to me. A lot of people have discovered this in the last couple of years because of COVID. They realize now I can, commute by Zoom, or I can have, collaborations with other people without having to show up at the office. To me, I haven't had an office for many years now.
Yeah.
And I love it. I never want an office job. But on the side of my living space, my home, I have such a different conception of what home is now that I think it would be very difficult for me to buy into the the system that most folks have just taken for granted and go get an apartment somewhere. I don't think I could do it, especially with apartments. I think that as a working class guy, I think that the only way people can get ahead is through ownership. And I would rather own a tiny house, or rather build something like a container house or something like that than go rent from anyone.
Yeah.
I think it's the only way we can get ahead as working class people. And with this situation, I paid $8,000 for this boat.
That's
half of what
less
than half of what I paid for my car.
You're looking around and it's got like mid-century modern styled mahogany custom furniture in here. Like it's and now that everything functions, it's like, are you kidding me? Like, you paid that much for this? Is an incredible deal. Now, I had to put a lot more. I had to put tens of thousands into it, but we're still talking about like less than $50,000 for me to own everything on this boat. And
people will spend $400,000 on a house and still put tens of thousands of dollars into it.
Right. So to me, it's really about giving myself some freedom to make choices. And when I'm not house poor anymore. I used to be house poor when I had a condo and I was paying, as much as I could afford on my mortgage. But I'm not anymore. I have a lot of freedom to do things that I want, including travel or working on film production. In this case, I put a lot of money into producing this film. So that sort of thing would not have been possible if I had been kind of chained to the typical systematic way of living, which is buy a new car with a 5-year payment plan.
Yep.
Get that fully insured. Rent an apartment, get renter's insurance, like all of these other things that just add up and add up and add up. And I feel like I'm looking at that system from the outside and going, wow, I don't regret getting out of it. I don't regret breaking away.
Yeah. I was working an office job when COVID hit. I got furloughed, and since then I've just done my own thing, and it's that weird. Like I used to be like, okay, I am at work, and I am at home, and now it's like it's so hard to separate. Like people are like, oh, you need time off, and I'm like, yeah, but my job sometimes is going to hang out at a brewery and watching a comedy show that I put together, and that doesn't feel like work.
Right.
I mean, I stress about it if we don't have enough ticket sales and whatever, but I find it sometimes difficult to explain my lifestyle to other people, especially them like, what do you do for a living?
Yeah.
So like, do you have that same thing when people are like, oh, where do you live? And you're like, I mean, on a boat?
I live in a pineapple under the sea. Yeah. Right? I mean, I might as well say that because I get the same damn response. Like, you do what?
Yeah.
And most people are actually quite similar in their response. They say, oh, I heard of someone who's done that before, but I've never actually met anyone. And that was my feeling about it when I thought about this first. I'd heard of people doing it, but I had no firsthand knowledge. So I hope that this film can correct that deficiency in the public's knowledge about what it means to live aboard a boat, that it is a legitimate lifestyle, that when it's done correctly by the book, that these people are capable and they're conscientious. They protect each other. They protect the environment. They do things in a way that is legal and permissible. Mm-hmm. And I hope that in places like New York City, where liveaboards haven't really been allowed except for one little marina on the West River, on the Hudson River, I think that places like New York City should take note and say that this is a legitimate lifestyle, and we should encourage people to do this, noting that there are rights and responsibilities in this different way of life.
When does the movie officially come out? Because I know it's not officially out. You've shown it at some film festivals.
So it's been at several film festivals over the last year. It was nominated for Best Documentary at the Swedish International Film Festival. Won an honorable mention at a festival in Paris at the Around Film Festival. It won Best Documentary at the San Diego Art Film Festival, and it's been shown in many other places. I think the folks in Europe are interested in it because it's a film that shows an interesting way of life all across America. I cover every American coast, geographically speaking, including Hawaii, Alaska, the West Coast, and that's PNW, and like further south by San Diego and LA. Then the Gulf Coast, including like Galveston and New Orleans, and then over to the East Coast from Florida to Baltimore to Boston and New York, all the way up. So I think there's sort of a panoramic view of America, and that's very interesting to people from outside of America who are considering alternative ways of life. Maybe they're coming here from a country where their money doesn't go so far, and they'd like to know how to live on a budget, live a little bit below the radar. That's a great way to do it. Yeah. And I think in the United States, people are interested because we've already been sort of enamored with the van life and the tiny house thing. And frankly, I think that the liveaboard lifestyle is in the same vein, but it kind of kicks it up a notch in terms of the elegance and the beauty that is attainable through this this incredible lifestyle.
But when's it coming out?
So let's talk about the festivals and blah blah blah. It's
More so, I know
this,
when we can put this.
Yeah, it's
out.
coming out in the spring.
Okay.
But I have to. I'm finalizing contracts right now with the musicians. I have music.
It's got
from,
great music in it.
Thank you. So the music was very important to the way that I edited the film. I had the music in mind before I even started filming.
Yeah.
And
is it a cellist or?
Yes.
Yeah.
So the cellist who performs most of the music is Eric Friedlander, and he's actually the son of Lee Friedlander, the social documentary photographer who was quite famous in the mid-century. And what he did was Lee Friedlander took his family on an expedition around America in an Airstream when he was photographing America.
Yeah.
And that album that I use as sort of a de facto soundtrack is called Block Ice and Propane, and it's basically a solo cello where Eric Friedlander is kind of recounting that childhood adventure that his dad took him on across America to photograph everything. And I felt like there were a lot of analogies to be drawn between that story that he told sonically and the adventure that I was going on. It was an odyssey in a sense of sailing around the world and trying to find a way back home to be closer to my son. And I felt like Eric's adventure was also sort of an odyssey, traveling around America to explore its essence. And I felt like he was incredibly expressive and able to tell a strong narrative with that single instrument. He's just a really impressive artist. And
the part that blew me away was there was a young lady that was talking about her brush with death and where she ended up falling out of a dinghy and slicing her foot open, and you could see she was really upset by it, and the cello music there was like you felt it,
right?
Like, for sure. It was very like uneasy and disconcerting, and it was great.
That was, I think that one was called Cold Chicken, I think is what that track was called. But Megan Sample's story about falling overboard in her dinghy, and her boyfriend had turned off the kill switch. Normally a small boat's supposed to have a kill switch with a lanyard on it.
And then I loved how you're like, they're not together anymore.
Yeah. So if you fall over on a small boat like a dinghy, it's supposed to have this thing that pulls the key out of the ignition, and boom, it shuts off the motor so that the boat doesn't drive away. Or in her case, she managed to catch the boat. She managed to grab on and hold on to it. But then when she was climbing back in, the motor was still turning and it chopped up her foot. And she could have, she got in the boat and could have bled to death. Yeah, it was really a nasty injury. So she was quite lucky to have caught herself, because the boat would have driven away and she was in the ocean swell. Yeah. So she could have drowned, first of all. But when she got back in and realized that the propeller had chopped up her foot and was squirting blood all over the boat, that must have been really horrifying. And she was pretty traumatized even during the interview. You could tell that recounting that story was a very brave act, and I was very grateful for Megan's bravery in telling that story, because I think it helps people to appreciate the risks. And also to, just from a sense of women's empowerment. She had an intuition that something wasn't, right about that, and and now she's a big advocate of boater safety, and I think that she's not, one who's going to take things for granted when her boyfriend tells her that this is how things are supposed to go. Like, she realizes that you have to look out for yourself, and you have to be smart and use not just common sense, but you have to think things through when you're going out on the water, and you have to make sure that you're doing everything you can to keep yourself safe, because it is dangerous at times. So Megan's story was fantastic, and the soundtrack. I had a little bit of creative tension with trying to push it, make it a little bit louder, a little bit more intense, because I wanted people to feel uncomfortable.
And it worked for me. So excellent work, because it definitely it's a hard thing to do, I think, to kind of like get that kind of tension from someone just telling a story. You know, it's one thing when you have a production budget and you can recreate the special effects and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But just for someone telling this story that is essentially, I fell out of a boat and cut my foot.
Right.
But to really feel that's there, you felt the danger and
yeah. And that's the amazing thing about Eric Freelander's album is that he managed to go through this very similar range of emotions in his story when he was a child traveling across America with his father. And I felt like
I want to know what his issue is with cold chicken now.
I don't know, but it was like I could imagine his situation, but the music also worked incredibly well for conveying the emotions that I wanted to convey throughout this film. I understood his album. I listened to it many times before I started editing this film, and then when I decided that I wanted to use that kind of folksy narrative, and the cello is a deliberate choice too. Mm-hmm. This boat that I'm on right now, that we're sitting on, is kind of a cello of a boat. It's a little bit big, but it's not ungainly.
Yeah.
And it's capable of being beautiful and elegant. And I think that's an appropriate instrument to convey what it's like. And you know, as I said, I'm single-handing it down the coast right now. And that's a solo act. So these things were all important in constructing a sonic metaphor for me in the film. And I used that from the beginning to shape the narrative. And the music, in a very meaningful way, leads the emotions and the narrative.
Do you often bring additional crew on to, like...
No.
No, it's just because you're like, oh, you know, I'm soloing it down. I'm like, oh, is there ever like...
No, but it's unusual to solo, you know, to single hand a boat this size. I think it would be reasonable for me to take 2 extra people. So being able to do it by myself,
that would make this seem less comfortable.
Yeah, let me put it this way: I have to be very careful about the risks that I manage, and when I'm planning out the rest of this voyage, I have to take it in small pieces.
Yeah.
I am not going to be pushing myself any single day or in any way. When it comes to any risk with weather, I'm going to hold off for a day or two. If there's any risk with, I don't know if I can make it that far in a day before dark, I'm going to hold off. I'll break it down into 2 trips and maybe go to anchor somewhere at a safe harbor, or maybe come into a marina at a safe harbor marina. So it's just not... I would say that for most people who haven't spent a lot of time sailing, you should not even consider single-handing something. It's dangerous. But for me, I think it's just a matter of managing the risk with what I know how to do. And my boat has a lot of backup systems. I've got 2 engines. I've got parts for pretty much everything. I could rebuild my engines out at sea if I need to. And I have the tools for that. But you know, most people aren't in that kind of situation where they're at that level of preparedness or knowledge.
Well, as we're closing this out, let me ask, is there anything from quote-unquote normal life that you miss?
Yeah, I wish I had a cat. You know, I'm a cat person.
Okay. But I feel like a lot of those people did have pets.
Yeah, they did, but I feel like my space probably isn't big enough for a cat.
Yeah.
And I know a couple of those folks. I've gotten to know some of their cats over the years, and I think the cats go a little bit crazy.
Yeah.
They like to be able to walk the docks, but not all the marinas will tolerate that.
Yeah.
One time, one of the cats that I knew became a stowaway on another vessel that went out to sea.
Wow.
So, you know, they got to the next port and said, "Where the hell did this cat come from?" You know, like it's... Yeah, so having pets is like something that I kind of miss.
Yeah,
I'd really like
the one that I found confusing is the dogs. I'm like, how do you, when you're out, how do you walk the dog?
Yeah, so like with Megan, she had that enormous dog, but a year after that interview, the dog was rehomed.
Yeah,
I guess is the word they would use. It was rehomed to a farm so that it had the space to run. You can't keep a big dog on a boat.
That's what they tell people when their dogs die.
Rehomed?
No, that like, oh, they're on a farm where they can run.
Oh, really?
You never heard that? Yeah,
Oh.
like when people like are little and their dogs pass away, they'd be like, oh, they're on a farm upstate where they can run. You've never?
No, mine always got run over by cars. So
Okay.
yeah, I guess I was one of those people who just faced reality.
Yeah. No, I just think that's like the stereotypical like parent answer.
Yeah,
Right,
maybe. No, I would always bury the corpses after they were run over.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Maybe that's one of the things about boaters is that you can't bullshit the ocean.
Yeah.
You know, it's gonna do what it's gonna do to you, and you have to be either ready or face the consequences. So
More people should learn to be that way in life.
yeah, it's a good skill.
Yeah.
It's a valuable skill.
It's awesome. Well, I want to say thank you, man, for having me on the KGB. This is an awesome boat. It's very,
Thank you.
very cool.
Thank you.
And the total fluke that this even happened. Like, you just happened into the beer cellar, and Tatum happened to tell me about you, and I'm like, hook a brother up with an interview. That sounds great.
Yeah, I'm glad she introduced us. This has been a lot of fun.
So best of luck with the movie, and we're going to hold off on putting this out until it's closer to release date. And, you know, hopefully it'll be on Amazon Prime or wherever.
I think I'm thinking that it's probably going to be on Apple and Amazon, and Amazon is curating their content right now, so they have a special longer process for deciding whether or not they want to sell your stuff. But as long as they meet technical specifications, it'll be available on Apple.
Yeah, cool, awesome, man. Thanks so much.
All right,
and for our listeners, we'll see you guys next week. And thanks for checking out the show today, listeners. If you enjoyed the content today, you can go over to patreon.com/Inebri-art to support the show. You can join over there for just a few dollars a month and help us provide this fun content that you just checked out. You can also email us at Inebri-art.com with your questions, complaints, and concerns, or you can find us on all social medias at Inebri-art or at Inebri-art6 on Instagram. And also don't forget to check out our other shows, Bar Talk Podcast, Old Colony Cast, Inebri-art, and all the other shows on the Inebri-art Network, which you can find at Inebri-art.com. So thanks again for listening.